So I was gonna make a video reviewing 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, but it's been a while since its release, so I figured I might as well just use this time to make a wider video about Martin McDonagh's films in general. I'd recommend watching his films before watching this, and I'd also recommend watching his films to anyone who's not going to watch this too. They're just really good films. And I want to talk a bit about what I love so much about them. So far, Martin McDonagh has made just 3 feature films: In Bruges, Seven Psychopaths, and 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Now, I'd consider all of these great films. But before I get into why I love his movies, I want to talk a little bit about McDonagh himself and how black comedy functions within his films. Dark comedy or black comedy is used to describe a comedic style that tends to make light of serious or taboo topics. Black comedy works because of how cathartic it is. Instead of having to worry about something terrible happening, you get to laugh at it instead. In both Burn After Reading and Pulp Fiction, 2 films that could be considered black comedies or to have darkly comic elements, there's a comedic moment involving someone getting shot in the face. In Death at a Funeral, you're still laughing when it appears they've possibly killed someone, or when a man is threatening to throw himself off the roof. Topics like suicide, death, or even terrorism are things that a lot of us as humans kind of stress about a lot. So I think if you're able to find the funny side in it, it makes life a lot easier. Although if you live in Scotland, this is apparently illegal now. My point is, I think we try to laugh at tragedy and evil because it's our weird way of gaining control over it. To be sad is to succumb, but to laugh is a way of surmounting the negative. I think this plays into Martin McDonagh's approach to comedy.
All of my writing kind of comes out that way, as kind of darkly comic, and I guess it's the way I sort of see the world. You see the grimness and the darkness and the sadness, but you can't do anything about it if you let it get you down. So you got to try and find not the humor in those things, but you got to kind of deal with them with humor, I think. But you can't gloss over the sadness at the same time.
But I think McDonagh's films are about a lot more than that. I'll show that in just a small example on how they approach tragedy. Similar to films like Burn After Reading or Pulp Fiction, Martin McDonagh's films explore ideas of tragedy combined with comedy. However, he never uses comedy to shy away from the tragedy. His films never laugh or ask you to laugh at tragedy. Death or suffering is never the punchline or a joke itself. Whenever something truly tragic is shown on screen, he doesn't always try to undercut it with a joke to make it more easily digestible. He shows it honestly. Consider how Shaun of the Dead undercuts the death of Sean's father, calling back to the father's established hatred of loud music.
No, listen to me, Mum, listen! There's not even your husband in there, okay? I know it looks like him, but there is nothing of the man you loved in that car now, nothing! Let's go, shall we?
Versus even injuries in McDonagh's films.
I can't see out of this cyclone. I have to go to the hospital.
I'll drive you.
And by the way, saying this does not mean I think Shaun of the Dead is bad for undercutting a serious moment. I think Shaun of the Dead is a brilliant comedy. I'm just using this to illustrate differences in approaches to tragedy. Of course, there is some humor in these scenes.
Chloe, I can't see, I swear it.
Oh, stop whinging like a big gay baby.
He deals with them with humor, but he never uses the humor to detract from the seriousness of what's happening. And he always ends on a serious note, rather than one that undercuts the seriousness. So I think that in this way, McDonagh writes his films very honestly and naturally. He has a really good sense of tone, and I think he manages to blend comedy and tragedy perfectly. Because it's not just jumping from one to the other, it's understanding that they often kind of work hand in hand. Because when we see something atrocious, we want to laugh at it, we want to find the funny side, something to help us get away from the reality of what we saw. And McDonagh knows when not to give you a way out, when he should let you just sit in it and really take it in. When you have comedy throughout the entire movie, and then in the moment you really want a joke to come in, or for it to just cut to the next scene, he leaves you to witness it. The kind of impact that expectation and denial can be seriously striking. Now, this may seem kind of counterproductive. I mean, if black comedy is all about overcoming the sadness, then surely dropping all the comedy in the saddest parts is neglecting what black comedy is meant to do. However, we often revisit these events in hindsight with a comedic lens. We have the visceral human experience in the moment and perceive it like it should be, but then later we're given the comedy around it. In this way, I think he kind of achieves the best best of both worlds, with the unflinching human lens unsoiled by the dark humor, such as having a genuine suicide attempt and then later having the nature of that scene ridiculed by Harry.
Not only have you refused to kill the boy, you've even stopped the boy from killing himself, which would have solved my problem, which would have solved your problem, which sounds like would have solved the boy's problem.
In terms of surmounting the negative, as I mentioned earlier, I think that action has a lot more weight and meaning to it if we can do it even after seeing it in such an honest form first. When the tragedy is already shown in a comedic light, it's kinda easier to laugh at, but seeing it so honestly portrayed first, and then finding the funny bits about it, is a lot more impactful, and it takes a lot more skill to pull off. We don't laugh at Ken's suicide, but you might laugh at him offering Ray a mangled gun for protection. But I don't think any of this would work as well as it does if the characters weren't as well written as they are. Honesty is also a big part of how McDonagh writes characters, and by extension the story they inhabit and influence. Each character has things about them where you can get a sense of what kind of person they are from the first scene they're in, but it's just that, a sense. Because he gives you that to allow you to assume things about them, only for you to learn so much more about them as the film goes on. Sometimes this strengthens what you know, sometimes it explains it, or adds context which changes how you look at it. But they feel like real people, because although you're able to get that initial sense of them at first, it takes time around them to really get to know them well, which is a lot closer to reality. If his films had a first act that just told you everything you needed to know about the characters going in, they'd feel more like objects of the story rather than the perpetrators of that story. And I think this is key for building a believable movie world. If his characters didn't feel so unique, they wouldn't feel so real. None of them feel like stereotypes or cookie cutter film characters, they feel like real people. In any one of his films, it feels like these people still had a life off screen, that things are still happening when the camera is somewhere else, and that people are still going about their lives before the story started and even after it ends. It feels much more like witnessing a significant time period in someone's real life than a play that spawned in just for our amusement.
Ken, I grew up in Dublin. I love Dublin. If I'd grown up on a farm and was retarded, Bruges might impress me, but I didn't, so it doesn't.
It's clear that for some of these characters, he draws on himself to start the basis for them, but then fleshes them out into something new. It's how he came up with both of the main characters for In Bruges.
By the middle of the second day, I was bored out of my head because there's not an awful lot to do apart from go to the churches and the museums. So I just wanted to get drunk or get laid or anything. And that kind of became two characters in my head, the culture lover and the drunken whore.
And I mean, the main character of Seven Psychopaths is a screenwriter called Marty, but it's still clear that these characters aren't just elements of his own personality, otherwise they'd just come across really two-dimensional. His own experience is the seed, but he allows the stories and characters to reach far outside his own personal experience. He starts from this odd or unique, simple perspective and then builds up a whole character and story around this focal point.
Back about 17 years ago, I was on a bus through America and saw something not dissimilar to what we see on the first and second billboards. It stuck in my mind, just the idea of who would have put something like that up. Once I decided it was a woman and a mother, things just kind of almost wrote themselves to a degree.
And he writes the characters as these purposefully flawed beings. He does this not just because it's more close to reality, but he wants you to kind of question the actions of all these people. You're more involved in a story when you actually have to think about where you stand on the character's actions, more than a story where the good guy who's always completely right is against the bad people who are always completely wrong. This also fits well for the stories he tells. In Bruges is all about judgment and consequences. Bruges is kind of a purgatory, in which Ray is stuck until he faces judgment in one form or another.
I'll go to that house, apologise to the mother there, and accept whatever punishment she chose for me. Prison, death, it didn't matter.
Seven Psychopaths is all about the judgment of an audience, how people perceive or react to a story and what their expectations are. And Three Billboards is all about personal judgment of the people around you, how you might not know that person's full story before judging, or how your reaction to them could be part of the problem. It's about how understanding a person's position is more important and productive than vilifying them outright and acting against them as such. And this is a big part of why I love his films so much. They're tightly crafted, character-driven studies in human nature. It's never black and white, there's humanity in everyone, even the villains. Harry has his own set of harsh principles, but sticks to them even when it means his death. Charlie was the one who was wronged and just wanted his stolen dog back. And Chief Willoughby was genuinely trying his best with the difficult case, while also battling cancer and the fears that come with approaching the final stages of your life. And similarly, the good guys have obvious negative traits worked into them. As such, when watching any of his films, you're just drinking in the actions of every character without prejudice, seeing their strengths next to their flaws.
But Martin's somebody that never lets you get away from the humanity of the characters as well. You know, he stays away from judging them. He stays away from just vilifying both these men and shows that there is a human cost, an emotional cost even personally, for both of them doing what they do.
You know, at the same time as trying to lead a good life, I have to reconcile myself with the fact that yes, I have killed people.
But there's another type of character that McDonagh considers. McDonagh understands well that the setting is as much of a character of the story as the people are. The setting plays into the actions of the characters as well as the direction of the story. A particular location brings with it certain cultures and dynamics that are unique to that location. So by putting odd characters in a specific location already adds a certain context to what's going on. Not just that, but even the rooms and the buildings are used as characters within the scenes. Like the way the new chief has to crane his neck around this wonderfully placed pillar, or how Ray's dragged feet echo around the church. Location has an impact on how you experience a scene. Think about this scene. Look at what this room tells you about Yuri before we even hear him talk. Think about the kind of person that lives in this house.
There are not many people around in these alcoves in Christmas time. If I were to murder a man, I would murder him here. Are you sure this is the right word, alcoves?
This is another thing that clearly works into how McDonagh comes up with his stories. I mean, 2 of his 3 movies have direct reference to the location in their title. And yet despite being raised in London, he's never set a film in London. And when he was best known as a playwright, he would often set his plays in rural Ireland, where his parents were from. His decision to set stories in places he's not intimately familiar with is a deliberate one. I think he tries to stay away from making the films totally about his own experiences. When you make your films totally about you and what you've been through, you seriously limit the kind of unique directions the story could take.
Too based upon your own life or what's happening around you, the possibilities for story and where a story can go can be lost. So displacing it just a little bit to a place I did know somewhat, and I've gotten to know a lot more in the last few years. It just helped let stories evolve and let the characters go to a place that they wouldn't have done if I kept them in London.
There's also just something poetic about using the dreamlike medieval fantasy setting of Bruges for a tale about death, guilt, and consequences. And lastly, I want to talk about the kind of effort he puts into his films. McDonagh clearly cares a lot about making a good film. He doesn't half-ass or phone in anything. He makes sure that all the little details are there and accounts for everything. He ensures that the story and the characters are tight by writing characters for actors that he knows he can pull something special out of. He gets actors he knows will really get under the skin of these characters and make something believable and true. His ability to work well with actors clearly shows through in his movies with just how perfectly everyone works together. His talent for playwriting shows through on how real his dialogue feels, while also being clear that he doesn't rely on improv to draw out all of the comedy.
A dialogue that kind of captures the way we really speak through its oddness. I find it hard to explain, but I think if we wrote down verbatim everything that we say on a day-to-day basis, it would look crazy. It'd look like hieroglyphics.
You're right.
And the stories contain brilliantly natural setups and payoffs, like the scene from In Bruges where Ken is forced to break a 50 when he's just a couple of cents off the tower price. This not just shows Ken's character in how he believes on giving people a bit of leeway just to be nice.
The boy had to be let go. The boy had to be given a chance.
But it also sets up a scene later where he drops the coins from the tower to clear out a space for him to land without hurting anyone. A lesser film would have been fine with just having him drop the coins without the previous scene. I mean, it's not unreasonable that someone would have coins on them, but this edition really keeps the filmmaking tight with how it set it up, but also displayed the characters of both Ken and the tower guard.
Come on, man, it's only 10 cents.
Entry is €5.
There's not a wasted moment because even scenes where something is being set up for later, it's simultaneously used for world building, character building, or comedy. Like how they both tell the fat Americans not to go up to the tower because it's too narrow, and that causes the tower to be closed and empty for the finale. Because McDonagh knows how to exploit the expectations of the audience. You may have had it where you're watching a film and you're like, oh right, they mentioned this thing, I guess they'll bring that up later. Or, oh, X is obviously here to set up Y. I never feel like that with Martin McDonagh's films. For example, in a conversation about consequences, Ken mentions killing someone who came at him with a bottle. Since this was displaying both of their characters' responses to the story, I never thought it was to set up later when Ray gets attacked with a bottle. And since that scene again was showing Ray's character and how he jumps to the offensive when the lad had been shit-talking his date, I didn't think that it would come back to be the reason he ends up being brought back to Bruges. So clearly there's a lot of consideration being put into how the audience perceives the scene. These kind of multi-purpose scenes means that the story never feels manufactured, but that everything still satisfyingly comes around. There's never a wasted moment. Instead of having a scene where Dixon goes to commit suicide but then doesn't, McDonagh knows it's enough just to have the gun be in the scene when we know he's at his lowest point. It doesn't need to be any more obvious than this. The concern is there, and since the suicide of his best friend has already happened, we can fear it's a serious possibility. I think that even on those small levels, McDonagh retains respect for the intelligence of the audience to understand what's going on, and I really appreciate that. Also how he shied away from the tidy but ultimately unrealistic ending of 3 Billboards by not just having this guy be the murderer. Because if he had, I absolutely would have marked the movie down for it. It would have been an easy way out, but it would have sullied the message of the whole film in the process. His denial of tidiness for the sake of convenience is something I think lends well to the film's not feeling fake or rushed, that he clearly puts time and effort into it all. Also just little details that a less attentive director might miss out completely, like the beads of sweat on someone's head when they're supposed to have just walked up a long flight of steps, or during a chase sequence having Harry pull out a map of Bruges, considering he just arrived and shouldn't know his way around yet. I also appreciate his attention to detail in terms of honestly representing depression. The scene where Ray is just looking in the mirror and touching his face was perfect in capturing that state of feeling like you're outside your own body, to the point where it's hard to recognize yourself anymore. His depression and guilt representing themselves in these subtle ways is really telling of the admirable effort that went into the film. And the fact that just before he decides to commit suicide, he's suddenly very calm and seemingly happy. This is very true to how actual depression and suicidal tendencies show themselves. And I appreciate this accurate depiction of it, so that more people know that depression isn't some insanely obvious thing, but has signs that you can look out for. Similarly, his honesty in showing how grief and abuse affect people in 3 Billboards is also admirable, especially with the degree of skill he pulls it off, so it doesn't feel like the movie just stops to give you a PSA on suicide awareness. I just want to finish up with talking a little bit about the trailers, because although I think his films display honesty in their representation of a lot of things, the trailer for In Bruges is anything but honest. The trailers for it, as well as the cover, made it seem like some fun, witty crime romp, rather than the existential drama that it is. They made it seem more like it was something like Snatch or Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. I'm sure the studio probably just didn't know how to market it accurately, so they just made it look like a straight comedy. Seven Psychopaths had a very comedy-esque trailer too, although in fairness, that one actually is a little closer to a straight comedy. But 3 Billboards actually had an accurate trailer. It's actually relevant to the tone and the plot of the film. I just thought I'd say that I'm really happy with his style being recognized on a public and studio level to the point where his trailers can be like this. Because overall, Martin McDonagh's films are tightly written, brilliantly acted, tonally impressive, thoroughly entertaining and rewatchable pieces on humanity. I love the fact that he's managed to find the medium that he can excel at to the full extent of his talents, and I love that he's being recognized as such, and I'm excited to see what he does next.